Welcome back, everyone. We have a great second half of the program for you this afternoon. So we're going to kick things off in the next session with an Education Insiders Roundtable. We're going to hear from folks on the Hill in kind of policy positions, some real experts who have current and a lot of history and a lot of expertise in what's going on now, and we'll have some great perspective on what's coming in the next couple years. So I'd like to thank our sponsor Pearson for making this event possible today, and I'm going to introduce now Shilpi Niyogi from Pearson, who is going to give us an introduction to the next session. Shilpi?
On behalf of my colleagues and I at Pearson, I'm really thrilled to be a part of the conversation today and to help make this possible with our colleagues at EdWeek and Gallup. Lauren Kammerer, who's going to moderate the panel, will do the official introductions. I'll just share a quick reflection with you that I had shared with Chris earlier. It hit me that about 25 years ago when I entered education, we had just come off of having then President George Herbert Walker Bush bring together the nation's governors, headed up by Bill Clinton, and the first National Ed Summit. And for about 20 years, while there were differences about the role of states and feds and all of that, there was a lot of consensus about what the reform agenda should be, the move to higher standards, et cetera. And it seems like we're now seeing a different era start. So I'm really curious to see what the panel has to say about what this new era is going to look like and where we go from here. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren.
He was only kidding about when he was far.
Thank you for joining me. My name is Lauren Kammerer. I am working? There we go. All right, sorry about that. My name is Lauren Kammerer. I am the congressional reporter at Education Week, and we have just a wealth of knowledge on the stage here today. So we're going to get right to it. I first want to introduce the crowd here. We have Roberto Rodriguez over here. He is the director of Deputy Assistant to the President for Education. We have David Cleary, who's the Chief of Staff for Lamar Alexander. Jamie Festo, who is the Director of Education Policy for George Miller. Carmel Martin, who runs Education Policy at the Center for American Progress and who was also previously at the Education Department. And Neil McCluskey, who is at the Cato Institute. So welcome. Thank you very much. And we have a really great group of people here, excited for a robust conversation. So we are going to jump right into a conversation about No Child Left Behind reauthorization so that we can get to some really great questions from the audience later. And I first wanted to start with you, Roberto. Duncan has famously said, waivers are the opportunity to give states to test education policy, different education policies that may potentially inform a future NCLB reauthorization. And having spent a couple years now in the waiver world, I'd love to hear from you what the do's and don'ts are from the administration's perspective as to what you would like to see in a reauthorization.
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to participate in today's panel. Try to fix that. Is that better? Or not better? I will do my best to speak up.
Here you go.
So, we really are at a tremendous time of change in our education system. We have, upwards of 45 states this fall that are implementing and teaching to new college and career-ready standards that reflect a level of knowledge and skill that's necessary to compete and win in today's economy. So we believe that the imperative to forge a new federal-state partnership around that goal of college and career readiness is more important than ever before. And that certainly is what we've tried to establish with the ESEA waiver process. We have over 43 states that are moving forward, raising expectations for teaching and learning in their schools, forging new accountability systems that provide greater flexibility from the lockstep of No Child Left Behind, but that account for the progress of all students and all subgroups, and are more meaningful in that we are raising the bar and focused on college and career readiness for all. And we're moving forward with new and important reforms to teacher effectiveness, teacher development, and teacher support through that waiver process. So, we believe that we'll be able to advance that important blueprint moving forward. The waiver process has always been a stopgap measure for us to the full reauthorization, full consideration of reforming No Child Left Behind. And we're encouraged by the opportunities to work on K-12 education as well as higher education and early education with the new Congress. I think you saw bills forged in both the House and Senate chambers on No Child that affirmed a lot of the policies that were part of the ESEA waiver process.
Okay, so what I heard you say is standards, accountability, and teacher effectiveness. And turning to David, now that Senator Alexander will, in all likelihood, run the HELP committee and have great influence on what a potential No Child Left Behind reauthorization bill would look like. If he was a kid in the candy store and could have anything he wanted, how do those three policies play into it? Obviously, taking into consideration that the president still has the potential of vetoing something.
Sure. Can you hear me? Good. Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's fun to see some longtime friends here. I think that Senator Alexander, he's hopeful, optimistic that he's going to be the chairman of the HELP committee. He has to run for it and get elected by his peers. We feel pretty good about our chances. But I think he's really eager to begin a conversation about what to do about No Child Left Behind. He has, I think, a very different worldview than where the administration has gone the past several years, and a very different worldview than where the Bush administration was before the Obama administration. He has said regularly and repeatedly that if he had been in Congress, he wouldn't have voted for No Child Left Behind because he thought it was too big of a federal intrusion into state government, into the decisions that need to be made at the state and local level. So that's kind of his worldview, that we need to really shrink the role of the Federal Department of Education and get out of the business of telling states what to do about their standards, their accountability systems, their assessment systems, their teacher evaluation systems. When he was governor of Tennessee, he was the first governor to kind of impose a teacher evaluation system and fought hard and long and got it in, and then as soon as he left, the teachers unions killed it. But coming up to Washington, he doesn't want to tell everybody what to do. He thinks that what we should do is create an environment where states can experiment and innovate and do things. We should use the bully pulpit to challenge them to do better. We use the NAEP assessment to highlight where things are going poorly, but that the federal government shouldn't tell states that they have to have Common Core standards. Federal government shouldn't tell them that they have to have specific teacher evaluation systems or teacher evaluation systems at all, and that we should really downsize the role of the federal government in telling states what to do about their accountability and assessment systems. So that's kind of his worldview of a kid in a candy store. But he's pragmatic. He is looking forward to his new partnership with, we assume it will be Patty Murray. They've got, the Democrats have their own process, but we assume that it'll be Patty Murray. I think the two of them are pragmatic deal makers. We passed the Workforce Investment Act after a decade of being stymied at every turn. When Republicans were in control, when Democrats were in control, and divided government, it took a decade, and Lamar and Patty and Johnny Isakson and Senator Murray, and others really worked on getting that passed. So I think that we've got a really big opportunity to work with Secretary Duncan in the White House and with Senator Murray and in the House to try and resolve these differences.
Great. And Jamie, I remember this past year, or last year as it is now, when a version of the No Child Left Behind reauthorization went through the House. It was a Republican bill. No Democrat voted for it. And your boss, George Miller, got down there and gave one of his really famous, fiery bully pulpit speech. His face turned red, the arms started flailing, said, "This is not good for children." Can you tell us a little bit about, I know, Lamar Alexander and John Klein have both stated that this will be they're pragmatic politicians, that this will be an open process. They would like to work with Democrats on this. What do you see as no-go areas for Democrats if that is to play out this bipartisan process?
Sure, and thanks again for having all of us. I think the way it went on the floor was the gentleman was out of time and George started screaming that the children are out of time. It was a George special for sure. It was a great time. And then he yielded back, which was possibly the best part, after he was minutes over. So I think for us, it was a great moment for George, and it was obviously the piece that got picked up on the news that night, which was another bonus. But that really was what it was about for him, and I think what it was about for Democrats. We're a caucus of broad beliefs, and yet we were able to coalesce everybody around a shared set of ideas that were right for kids. And that's why the Republicans weren't able to garner any votes from us. And I think that's really where they're going to be going into next year. As Roberto highlighted, the structure we established in our bill is not so different from the waiver structure. And I think one reason we did that is we have to be very mindful in these processes of what are we asking states to reinvent the wheel on and why. And by the time a bill would be signed or could be signed, we are years and years into the waiver process, and states are years and years into what they have been doing and the new assessments they're going to be using under their new standards. So I think when we ask states to change what they are doing on the ground and districts and then in schools, that has to be for a very concrete reason. I think the basic threshold for our guys is really around, is they're being asked to vote on better for kids or not? It's actually not much harder than that. And I think, we were proud to stand with the folks who stood with us on our bill, with the business community. It was the first time ever the business community endorsed a George Miller bill, I can assure you of that. And the civil rights community and the reform community. So and our members felt very good about the position we ended up in. I think very specifically, it's, as George has said and our members have echoed, he believes these are civil rights laws, first and foremost. And our questions, and these are the questions that George and our heads of the CBC and the CHC and the Asian Caucus have continued to ask the administration, are making sure that poor and minority kids are represented in the accountability structure, and it means something. It's not this that you're measuring them, it's that it drives interventions. And that's obviously a much more specific statement on what happens in ESE next year, but we've had some years to be very specific about this now, and I think that's something all of you need to demand of this process, that language is not used in broad terms, but at some point it has to be written on a piece of paper, and the president's going to have to evaluate whether he signs it.
Great. Let's dig down now into some, specific policy issues, and I'd love to hear from Carmel and Neil on this. In talking to both of your organizations, what are some of the policy issues that you would love to see included in this? And I'm thinking specific things like, for example, school choice measures, grade span testing, potentially, things like that. Do you want to start, Carmel?
Sure. Thanks for having me here today. I guess I would start by echoing something I think Jamie said, and to use your phraseology, do's and don'ts. Don't pass an accountability framework that means states have to go back to the drawing board. My experience in working with the states while I was in the administration tells me that by and large, states took it very seriously. They developed very robust systems that worked for their state, and we shouldn't upend that and have them start from scratch, because I think they are making some progress. They're moving forward with common core or new standards implementation and new teacher evaluation systems, and we should let them move forward with those. But do, as Jamie said, ensure that there's a continuing federal role that protects at-risk students. I think the thing that drove Congress, people like my old boss, Senator Kennedy and Congressman Miller, to support No Child Left Behind was because of that very critical role. We saw in a rampant way that particular groups of students, low-income, minority, students with disability, were not being well served by our system. We're not where we need to be just yet, and there's definitely ways for improvement with the new accountability systems under Flex, but we need to maintain a federal role to set parameters to ensure that happens. I also hope that Congress will consider increased funding for early childhood education, in particular preschool education. That is something that has great bipartisan support at the state level, and would love to see federal leadership on that front, as the president has proposed in his own budget. Also hopeful that the bill, if a bill moves, that it will tackle support for the teaching profession in a much more robust way. States have moved forward with new teacher evaluation systems. They're starting to use them to drive professional development support to particular teachers that is much more robust and targeted than was the case prior to having those systems in place. But there's a lot more we have to do to raise the level of instruction and instructional capacity in our schools. So we need to look at teacher preparation, teacher licensure, time that teachers have to plan and to adjust their instruction to the new standards. Our teachers spend twice as much time standing up teaching children than teachers in other high-performing nations do. In other nations, we recognize teachers need for time to prepare for their classes. And then lastly, I would hope that Congress would take a look at the distribution of resources, both federal resources and state resources, so we can ensure that the students who need the most help are getting more help, not less help, than students in high wealth districts. And I think there's some existing law provisions that actually don't help in that regard, but were intended to help. So hope that's something that Congress will tackle.
So potentially playing with Title I formulas, is that?
Well, the formula could certainly be strengthened, but there's things like supplement, not supplant, which is a provision that was designed to ensure that federal money was on top of, not instead of, state and local money. But the way it plays out in the real world is it limits the ability of schools, how schools can use their funding streams. So I think there's more effective ways to get at the issue of ensuring that federal money is supplements and doesn't supplant state and local resources. The Center for American Progress has a proposal on how we would do that that we're happy to share with the congressional and administrative representatives on the panel.
My guess is Neil and David's response might be something like, well, you could block grant that money to states and then they could use it the way they would like to. Is that where you might go with this answer?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is it's safe to assume I'm going to say basically the polar opposite of what Carmel said, other than thank you for having this panel. Ultimately, what I would like to see is we can look at the federal track record in education, higher education, K through 12, pre-K, and we see it doesn't actually work. So ultimately, what I'd like to see is that the federal government return to what the Constitution says it should do, which is not be involved in education outside of DC and ensuring that equal access is provided, that there's not discrimination by state and local governments. Obviously, that's not going to happen in the next 1 or 2 years. I think it's definitely a move in the right direction to say, look, we're going to block grant money, we're going to give states authority to control this. I think even more central, this may be the linchpin for me, is the waivers have to be eliminated. And when you look at Race to the Top, and you look at the waivers, and you look at Common Core, not everybody is like me and thinks the Common Core shouldn't have come from the top down. Not everybody thinks the Common Core is bad, but there seems to be a pretty broad consensus that implementation of Common Core has been very poor. And a major reason for that is the administration largely said, look, you're going to do this, you're going to do it on our timeline, and you're going to do it to get these waivers out of No Child Left Behind, which of course was also from the top down. I also think it's fairly certain that those waivers are illegal. There's nothing in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that says you can attach conditions to waivers. So I think that,
I'm sorry.
well, one second. Let me just.
There was a CRS report that actually said there was no illegality, so I just wanted to make sure that was clear for.
And let's also be clear that their law professors have looked at this and said it's actually fairly certain that you are making law through the executive department if you attach conditions to waivers. So this is, I think if you look at it objectively, fairly certain that it's illegal. But even if it's not illegal, the practical effect has been that this has rushed a lot of implementation, and a lot of people are very unhappy about that. If the waivers could be addressed, I think that that would be a huge step forward, although certainly block granting, giving states more control would be preferable.
Well, Lauren, I just need to jump in here just for a moment on a few of these points that Neil's raised. You know, I think when it comes to the waiver process and the process of setting standards, that continues to be a state-driven process. I think we need to be clear that college and career-ready standards, and the Common Core in particular, was a state-driven, state-determined process. Yes, our administration did incentivize the adoption of common standards with Race to the Top, but it also, I want to just point out and note relative to the waivers that there's no requirement that states have common standards to be able to receive a waiver. We have great states that are setting college and career-ready standards that are not common and are part of our waiver process. The waiver is really designed to establish a new state-driven process for recalibrating their accountability systems, their standards, teaching and learning to this level of college and career readiness. And this is a path that states were well on their way toward when the waivers came about. We did work with Congress for a couple years to try to jumpstart a full reauthorization of the No Child program. But we believe it's a really important focal point for establishing a new partnership with states from the federal level to help them advance reform on their own terms. And I think as has been pointed out, states will continue to move that process forward. And we want to make sure that the reauthorization respects that.
So this is a little taste of what you might expect next Congress. We could sit here debating probably for the next couple hours, but we wanted to throw it out to Q&A right about now. So if you have any questions, there are some runners in the back. If you just raise your hand. We have some on this side.
Hi, Joel Packer with the Committee for Education Funding. So one thing that hasn't been touched on is the impact that the budget resolution next year may have on not only ESEA, but all the authorizing committees. So the New York Times today quoted the Republican leadership as saying they intend to do a budget pretty similar to the Ryan budget, which last year's Ryan budget cut funding for non-defense discretionary funding, which includes education, would have eliminated the in-school interest subsidy on student loans, et cetera. So my question, I guess, is really mostly to David. If a budget like that indeed passes, and there's do you envision there being reconciliation instructions to the health and education committees, and how do you see that sort of just possibly overshadowing bipartisan work on authorization?
That's speculation after speculation. I would say that if the leaders have said that that's their plan, I'd take them at their word. I think there is a lot of interest in the Republican caucus on both the House and the Senate to pass a budget to emphasize our priorities and show the differences between the agenda that we've had and the agenda that the Republicans would like to put forward. I think that if there are reconciliation instructions, we will do what it is that we need to do. I think that Senator Alexander has long been an advocate for appropriate appropriations levels. He is an appropriator. He's on the Energy and Water Appropriations Subcommittee and is likely hoping to stay there. But we have $17 trillion in debt. We've got deficits that have shrunk in comparison to historically high deficits, but they're still very high. And my experience in Tennessee, having been there for the past several months with the boss, people are really, really afraid of the debt, and we need to get it under control. And there's a lot of waste and fraud and abuse that we can cut. That's easy. That's easy to say. It's hard to do. But there's a lot of things that the federal government doesn't do very well, and we need to figure out what those are and eliminate those and shrink those. Senator Alexander does believe in funding for Title I and IDEA and Title II and Pell Grants and all of that, and is going to continue to advocate for that. But so there's room for smart spending, but there's also room for some pretty smart cuts.
I think, can I respond to that as well? I mean, so House Democrats obviously opposed the Ryan budget pretty strongly. I think some of the dangers, though, are really in the higher ed space, which, Joel, I think is your point on reconciliation. And I think one of the other issues you hear so loud and clear on the ground is what's happening to folks coming out of college with massive student loan debt. And so the fact that what's on the table for reconciliation would be Pell Grant funding and in-school subsidies, I think should be fairly scary to those folks coming out now. Obviously, we all worked very hard to keep interest rates low last year, but if over and over again we're going to try and pay for the tax cuts under the Bush administration and how we couldn't afford those on the backs of those we want investing in the economy now, it's going to be a pretty damaging prospect.
It's always fun. It's always fun when somebody says that when Republicans are in charge, we can't cut higher education to spend on other things. But when Democrats, let me finish my sentence, please. But when Democrats are in charge, they can cut higher education spending so they can spend it on Obamacare.
Well, and let me just, and I'm not particularly political, so I'll just throw in the research, which is the research suggests very strongly that what student aid ultimately does is lead to higher prices because colleges raise their prices.
There's zero evidence for that.
You like to say there's zero evidence, except there's a lot of evidence. You're welcome to go to Cato's website and look at it. So we've got to try and deal with the reality. I'll send it to you. I'll make it easy.
Perfect. So let's move on to the next question so that we can spread it out a little bit. Trying to avoid any fist fights up here. No.
We've got to make it interesting, right?
We've all known each other way too long.
We're not in the South Korean legislature.
All right, do we have another question from the audience? Back there and then up here.
We have another question from the live stream. Can you summarize what your proposal for addressing the issue of supplement, not supplant is about?
It's pretty technical. I guess to sort of
Answer yes, you can.
I mean, essentially look at compare how much is being spent on low-income students relative to non-low-income students, as opposed to trying to manage how particular streams of funding are spent. So if the end result is that because of federal funding streams, low-income students in a particular school are equal to and hopefully greater than the funding that's attributed in that district to non-low-income students, then shouldn't that be the test? Not did this particular dollar go towards this particular activity?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's extremely wonky, and I think you'll definitely want to keep a close eye out on some changes to that, specifically through the amendment process if we get there with an NCLB reauthorization. That's probably where something like that would come into play. I think we had a question up here. No? Okay. Anyone else? All right, back here.
Leonard Spearman from Texas. Looking at some of the thoughts on FAFSA and reducing it down to 1 or 2 pages, which would be fantastic, and cutting back on some of the regulations in higher ed. Some of the other things that you all might be looking at in terms of higher education. Seems like you already started that discussion, but if you can continue on it a little bit more.
Sure, thank you. Senator Alexander and Senator Bennett from Colorado have been working on a bill to reduce the overcomplication of the FAFSA down to, right now, 2 questions. What's your family income and what's your family's size? And we had testimony from 4 witnesses that kind of spontaneously came to agreement at the hearing that that was something that we could do. At the end of the day, is it going to be more than 2 questions? Maybe. Maybe we have to ask a couple more. But it doesn't need to be 108. And we recognize that most students fill it out online, and so they have all the skip logic and all the stuff that simplifies it a little bit. But to Senator Alexander, it's kind of the essence of the problem with Washington. You just pile on year after year in an elementary and secondary education and higher education. You get well-meaning staff that all think that they've got a good idea, and they pile it on. And then we go to the next reauthorization. We don't eliminate anything from before. We just pile on new stuff. We pile on new stuff, and we pile on new stuff. And we get, a member with a story from a mom, and we get a senator with a story from a dad, and we just pile on a new requirement and a new stupid idea. And it's the FAFSA is now 108 questions. It's ridiculous. It's a huge burden on first-time students and students of color and low income, because they bring the form home to mom and dad, and they say, I can't fill that out, so they don't do it. We were at a community college, and they said that they lose 1,500 kids a year because of the FAFSA. And so if we can eliminate that, all of those stupid questions and shrink it down to 2, that would be a huge, huge increase for students. And we've gotten positive reaction. It's going to end up more than 2, we think, but it's a good start. And then on the rest of higher education, Senator Alexander wants to start with kind of a blank page. He voted against the last reauthorization because it was too much. It was too many new requirements, too many federal mandates, too much intrusion, and just all sorts of goofiness. And so what he wants to do with kind of each of the major issue areas is really start from scratch. What does accreditation in the 21st century need to look like? What does financial aid in the 21st century need to look like? What does the FAFSA need to look like? We think that there is, on 80 to 90% of higher education, there should be a lot of broad bipartisan ability to work together. There's always the goofy issues that split everybody up, and we can decide for a little bit and reach an agreement on everything else, and then fight the fight on the floor with the stuff that doesn't bring us together. But he really wants to look at things like skin in the game. He thinks that institutions of higher education, because of there's different theories behind it, but because the federal government has been so generous to that there's been a loss of control on costs. So one way to put some constraints on schools is to put some skin in the game. If you're a really good school and everybody gets out and great, then you're fine. But if you're not a very good school, you owe the federal government, the taxpayers, some money back for your bad performance. So we're looking at things like that. We've got an open door on all of this. The only thing that he's against is more regulation, and he'll continue to fight the idea that the federal government knows best.
I think higher education reform is a real opportunity for bipartisanship in the new Congress, and certainly work with our administration moving forward. FAFSA is a perfect example of a place where we can potentially come together. We have been able to cut in half the amount of time that it takes young people and their families to complete the FAFSA application, but we believe there's a lot more we can do. I think, some of the ideas that David's discussed here and that others here in Washington have talked about around risk sharing. I know AEI has a proposal that addresses that. Those are ideas that are worth thinking about. I do believe there is a real imperative to do more to support college completion as a national goal. The president set forth a goal that says by the end of this decade, we should aspire to lead the world with the highest proportion of college graduates. And that's going to require new innovation in higher education. It's going to require a focus on completion. It's going to require thinking about how we bring to scale new ideas and new approaches in this sector. We believe there's a lot more we can do with respect to addressing the affordability challenges in higher education and doing more to promote greater value and a greater focus on outcomes.
So we're going to just give Carmel the last word here and wrap it up.
Thank
the
you.
old days.
I just, isn't that great? Just to counter Neil's offer to send you research on tuition, I will send you all a report that CAP recently released that showed that the growth in tuition at public universities and colleges is actually attributable to states reducing their investment in the public system, and we have a proposal for a federal-state partnership to try to turn that around. That includes also looking at outcomes along the lines that you mentioned, David. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is we also have a proposal to use at the applicant's choice, to use the IRS and the tax filing system to make the FAFSA even simpler than 2 questions. So would love to share that with you.
If I didn't weigh in on the state funding of higher education, that is largely attributable to Medicaid. Medicaid's growth has gone so far out of the scope of reality that puts constraints on a governor, former governor, in funding state higher education, and that is one of the biggest drivers of why states have reduced their spending on higher education.
Well, that?
So really quickly, I just want to get thumbs up or thumbs down for reauthorization of No Child Left Behind this year. Like, is this the coming Congress where this is going to happen? I want this on record.
This year, 2015, or this year in the next month?
This next Congress.
I can work fast, but not that fast. Absolutely.
We have a dance partner with Congress. We are happy to work on reauthorization.
I actually think there's a reasonable chance of that happening, because I feel like there is some consensus on something. I think there's a consensus to reduce the testing burden. I think there's some consensus to devolve more power to the state. So I'll be a little optimistic and say maybe something will happen.
I think it's possible. I think it's a real question of everyone's leadership, and I mean everyone. So we'll see what everyone's real goals are and see if they can find some consensus.
No longer my job to get it done. I can say I'm skeptical. I mean, I think if they could produce a good bill, that would be great. But I'm concerned about, because of last Tuesday's results shifting to the right and it being very difficult to get a bill that doesn't give a blank check to states, which I don't think is a good thing to do.
Great. Well, thank you all. You guys have been fabulous panelists. Really.